The dust hasn't settled yet. It's October 19th, 202 BCE. On a flat, sun-scorched plain in northern Tunisia, about 100 kilometers southwest of Carthage, two armies stand motionless. Tens of thousands of men, weapons drawn, breathe heavily in the morning heat. For a brief moment, no one moves. On one side stand the Roman legions under Publius Cornelius Scipio. They are disciplined and rested, arranged in a new formation, one Scipio designed last night to defeat his opponent across the field. On the other side, Hannibal Barca. Let that name sit for a second. Hannibal, the man who crossed the Alps with war elephants in the dead of winter, the man who wiped out 3 Roman armies in 3 years, the man who turned the Battle of Cannae into the single worst military disaster in Roman history. 67,500 Romans killed or captured in a single afternoon. The man who camped on Italian soil for 15 straight years, and Rome could not remove him. That man is standing right there, but looking back at Scipio. And here is what makes this moment so extraordinary. Just one day before this battle, these two men met alone. No armies, no advisors, just the two of them on a plain between 2 hills, face to face. Hannibal spoke first. He offered peace. Scipio said no. So now it comes to this. What happened in this field in 202 BCE didn't just end the Second Punic War. It decided who would rule the Mediterranean for the next 600 years. It decided whether history would be written in Latin or in the Punic language. It gave us the Roman Empire, the spread of Christianity, and ultimately the entire cultural foundation of the Western world as we know it. And it all came down to one man's obsession with learning from his enemy, and one morning when that lesson finally paid off. This is the Battle of Zama. And I promise you, by the end of this video, you will never look at military history the same way again. And to understand why Zama mattered so deeply, you need to feel the weight of everything that came before it. The Second Punic War began in 218 BCE, when Hannibal, serving as the de facto military commander of Carthaginian Spain, besieged and destroyed the city of Saguntum, a Roman ally. Rome declared war. What happened next was something Rome's leadership genuinely did not see coming. Hannibal didn't wait to be invaded. He marched north, crossed the Pyrenees, moved through southern Gaul, and then, in one of the most audacious military moves in all of recorded history, crossed the Alps in winter with cavalry, infantry, and war elephants, losing roughly half his force to cold and starvation in the mountain passes. He arrived in northern Italy in late 218 BCE with a battered, exhausted, half-sized army. Rome looked at this and thought, this is manageable. They were wrong in ways they could not have imagined. Trebia, November 218 BCE, where Hannibal lured the Roman consul Sempronius across an icy river in the early morning, before the legions had eaten, and destroyed 2/3 of his army. Lake Trasimene, June 217 BCE. Hannibal set the most brilliant ambush in ancient history, hiding 40,000 men in morning fog along a lakeshore road, and annihilating a Roman army of around 25,000 in under 3 hours. The Roman commander Flaminius died in the fighting. His body was never found. And then came Cannae. By August 2nd, 216 BCE. The Roman Senate, fed up with defensive strategies, sent the largest army in Roman history, around 86,000 men, to destroy Hannibal once and for all. Hannibal had roughly 50,000. By any reasonable calculation, Rome should have crushed him. Instead, Hannibal executed what military historians still study today as the perfect battle. He placed his weakest troops in the center, allowed the Romans to push them back, creating a bulge, a concave line, while his stronger troops on the flanks held. As the Romans pushed deeper into that bulge, thinking they were winning. Hannibal's flanks wrapped around them like a closing fist. By the time the Romans realized what was happening, they were surrounded on all sides, packed so tightly they could barely lift their weapons. 67,000 Romans were killed or captured that day. The Roman Senate lost 80 members, a fifth of its entire body, in a single afternoon. I want you to really feel that number. In modern terms, that's like losing more people in one battle than the United States lost in the entire Vietnam War in one afternoon, against one general. And yet, and this is the part that's easy to forget, Hannibal did not march on Rome after Cannae. His cavalry commander, Hannibal, famously told him, "You know how to win a victory, Hannibal, but you do not know how to use one." Why Hannibal didn't march on Rome immediately after Cannae is one of history's great debates. Maybe he lacked siege equipment. Maybe he was waiting for Rome's allies to defect. Maybe he thought the shock alone would bring Rome to negotiate. Whatever the reason, it was his one irreversible mistake. Because Rome did not negotiate. Rome did not collapse. Rome did something that, frankly, it should not have been possible for a state that had just lost 200,000 men over 3 years of warfare. Rome kept fighting. They adopted the Fabian strategy, named after the dictator Fabius Maximus, shadow Hannibal, cut his supply lines, avoid pitched battle, and bleed him slowly. It wasn't glorious. Roman commanders who advocated this strategy were mocked for being cowardly. But it worked. Inch by inch, year by year. Hannibal could win battles. He could not take cities. But he could not get reinforced from Carthage, whose navy couldn't match Rome's at sea. He could not win the war. By 207 BCE, his brother Hasdrubal tried to march a second army from Spain through Gaul and into Italy to reinforce him. The Romans caught Hasdrubal at the Metaurus River and destroyed his army entirely. When Hasdrubal's severed head was thrown into Hannibal's camp, even the great general understood that the strategic situation had fundamentally changed. But he retreated to the toe of Italy and consolidated. He was no longer conquering, he was surviving. But he was still there. 15 years after Cannae, undefeated in the field, a ghost haunting the Roman imagination. That is the world into which Scipio Africanus stepped. In 211 BCE, news reached Rome that 2 of its generals in Spain had been killed, along with their armies, fighting Hannibal's brothers Hasdrubal and Mago. Spain was lost. The entire Roman military effort there had collapsed. Or the Senate needed someone to take command of the Spanish campaign. There were no volunteers. Every senior officer with political standing looked at the odds and decided their career was worth more than a death march to Iberia. One man raised his hand. Publius Cornelius Scipio, 24 years old. His father had been one of the generals killed in Spain. His uncle, too. His father-in-law had died fighting Hannibal earlier in the war. This was not just a military appointment for young Scipio, or this was personal in the most primal way imaginable. He got the command. What followed was one of the most remarkable military careers in Roman history. Scipio arrived in Spain and, rather than fighting defensively, did exactly what his enemies didn't expect. He struck immediately at Cartagena, the Carthaginian capital in Spain, capturing it in a single audacious assault. Then he systematically outgeneraled Hasdrubal and Mago in a series of engagements, culminating at the Battle of Ilipa in 206 BCE, where, outnumbered roughly 2-1, Scipio used the same kind of flanking maneuver that Hannibal had used against Rome and devastated the Carthaginian force. By 206 BCE, Carthage had been completely expelled from the Iberian Peninsula. Here is what I find genuinely remarkable about Scipio. Unlike most great commanders of the ancient world, he was not a natural improviser in the way Hannibal was. Hannibal's genius was intuitive. He read terrain, unread his enemies, and invented solutions on the fly. Scipio's genius was analytical. He watched, he studied, he took what worked, including what Hannibal had done to Rome, and he systematized it, improved it, and used it again. He was, in the most literal sense, the student who surpassed the teacher by understanding the teacher better than the teacher understood himself. He returned to Rome in 205 BCE and was elected consul. Or he then proposed something that nearly caused a constitutional crisis: a full Roman invasion of Africa. Take the fight to Carthage's doorstep. Force Hannibal home. The Senate was not enthusiastic. They'd been fighting this war for 13 years. The idea of opening a brand new front in North Africa while Hannibal was still in Italy seemed reckless to the point of lunacy. The elder statesman Fabius Maximus argued passionately against it. Scipio gave what may be the greatest speech in Roman military history. Italy has suffered long. Let her rest for a while. It is Africa's turn to be devastated by fire and sword. It is time a Roman army threatened the gates of Carthage, rather than that we should again see from our walls the rampart of an enemy camp. The Senate, reluctantly, gave him permission. Not a full army. He had to recruit volunteers. He did, and in 204 BCE, Scipio landed in North Africa. His gamble was about to pay off in ways that would reshape the world. Scipio spent his first year in Africa methodically. He won battles, he built alliances, and most critically, he secured the loyalty of Massinissa, the king of a powerful Numidian tribe whose cavalry would prove to be the single most important tactical asset of the entire war. The Numidians were the finest light cavalry in the ancient world. Fast, aggressive, brilliant at both pursuit and harassment. But Massinissa himself was a remarkable figure, a former ally of Carthage who had been personally cultivated by Scipio, who helped him defeat a rival for his kingdom. Now Massinissa owed Scipio everything, and he delivered. With Numidian cavalry supplementing his legions, Scipio won a stunning victory at the Battle of the Great Plains in 203 BCE, roughly 70 miles from Carthage itself. Carthage panicked, and in their panic, they did exactly what Scipio had been waiting for them to do. When they recalled Hannibal, think about what this meant. For 15 years, Hannibal had been the hunter. Rome had been running, absorbing, surviving. Now Hannibal was being called home to defend. The psychological inversion was complete. Before leaving Italy, Hannibal had to destroy something that would have taken years to replace: his horses. There wasn't enough shipping space to transport his cavalry mounts across the Mediterranean. So he killed them. But the man who had terrorized Roman armies with his brilliant cavalry tactics arrived in Africa without horses, with an army of veterans who were exhausted, aging, and, more than a few of them, not entirely thrilled about being transported to a foreign country to fight a war they thought they'd already won. He landed at the port of Hadrumetum, south of Carthage, in late 203 BCE. He spent the winter rebuilding, recruiting new soldiers, training them, and waiting for cavalry reinforcements. Most of the good Numidian cavalry had already chosen Massinissa's side. Hannibal ended up with around 4,000 horsemen, largely from a minor Numidian chieftain named Tychius. Carthage had actually agreed to preliminary peace terms with Rome, terms that were, all things considered, not catastrophic. Then Hannibal arrived, and the Carthaginian hawks, emboldened, repudiated the peace treaty. Or they even attacked a stranded Roman supply fleet in the harbor, stripping it of supplies and thus giving Rome a perfect justification for continuing the war. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Scipio was not a man who needed excuses to fight. I want to be direct about something before we get to the battle itself, because I think the popular image of Hannibal sometimes flattens what made him genuinely extraordinary. For Hannibal Barca was born around 247 BCE into one of Carthage's most prominent military families. His father, Hannibal Barca, was a formidable general in his own right. According to tradition, and this story has the ring of truth to it, even if the details are embellished, young Hannibal begged his father to take him on campaign when he was about 9 years old. Hamilcar agreed on one condition. Hannibal would have to swear an oath. Not loyalty to Carthage, not courage in battle. And he would swear never to be a friend of Rome. Hannibal swore, and he kept that oath for the next 55 years, right up until the morning he drank his poison. What made Hannibal different from other great ancient commanders was the completeness of his tactical vision. Most generals of his era fought battles the way they had been taught to fight them, in broad strokes, relying on numerical superiority or terrain advantage or shock. Hannibal fought battles as three-dimensional problems. He read terrain obsessively. He watched his enemies and identified their habits, their vanities, their predictable responses, and then he designed traps specifically calibrated to exploit those tendencies. The Lake Trasimene ambush works only if you understand that a Roman consul who has been frustrated by months of cautious maneuvering will eventually push forward recklessly. Cannae works only if you understand that a Roman army trained for frontal assault will keep pushing forward even when the tactical situation has turned against them, because that is what Roman soldiers do. They push forward. Hannibal didn't just react to his enemies, he predicted them. But I want to make an honest observation here, one that some people will disagree with. Hannibal's greatness was almost entirely on the battlefield. And as a strategist, in the sense of converting military victories into political outcomes, he was significantly less impressive. He won Cannae and didn't know what to do with it. He spent 15 years in Italy and couldn't finish the war. There is a version of Hannibal who is the greatest battlefield tactician who ever lived. There is also a version of Hannibal who never quite understood that battles are means, not ends. At Zama, he arrived at a fundamental disadvantage: no adequate cavalry, that untrained elephants. An army assembled mostly from scratch around a core of aging veterans who had been fighting since they were young men. He was, as Polybius would later write, fighting from a position of weakness. And yet, and this matters enormously, Polybius also said that Hannibal did everything that could be done. The plan he devised at Zama was not reckless or desperate. It was the best possible plan given the assets available. The problem was that those assets were not enough. Scipio Africanus is, I'll confess, the historical figure I find most personally compelling from the ancient world. Not because he was the greatest general. The argument for Hannibal being a purer tactical genius is credible, but because of what Scipio represents as a type of intelligence. He was a man who learned, not just from his own experience, but from his enemies, from the men who had beaten him and beaten Rome, from Hannibal specifically. In a culture that valued tradition and precedent above almost everything, Scipio was willing to look at what the enemy was doing, admit that it was working, and incorporate it. That sounds like it should be obvious. It is, in practice, extraordinarily rare. Most commanders, when they face a superior opponent, respond by doing what they already know how to do harder. Scipio responded by watching Hannibal until he understood him, and then using Hannibal's own methods against him. And there is also a dimension to Scipio's character that I think gets underplayed in the standard military history accounts: his political courage. Proposing the invasion of Africa when no senior Roman wanted to hear it, recruiting a volunteer army when the Senate wouldn't give him a proper one, trusting Massinissa when Numidian allegiances were shifting constantly. These were not safe bets. And they were the choices of a man who was confident enough in his own judgment to override institutional inertia. He was 33 years old at Zama. He had never commanded in a battle against Hannibal directly. Everything he had built toward this moment had been preparation for a fight he had never actually had. Or there must have been something in that morning, standing across from the man who had killed his father and uncle and defined his entire young life, that transcended military calculation. He turned it down anyway, refused the peace offer. Choose the fight. Whether that was the right decision strategically or personally is, honestly, a question I don't think history has definitively answered. But it is the decision that made history. In the late summer of 202 BCE, that both armies were maneuvering toward each other across the Tunisian hinterland. What followed was a strategic chess game played at the level of corps movement. Scipio moved southwest along the Bagradus Valley, the agricultural heartland of the Carthaginian Empire. This was brilliant on multiple levels simultaneously. By threatening Carthage's grain supply, he was forcing Hannibal to respond. By moving southwest, he was moving closer to Massinissa, whose cavalry was still en route. And by choosing an inland route, he was picking ground where his superior cavalry could be decisive. Hannibal understood all of this and marched in pursuit, hoping to force battle before Massinissa arrived. He came close. According to our ancient sources, his scouts captured 3 Roman spies, but rather than execute them, Scipio had them given a full tour of the Roman camp, then released. He wanted Hannibal to see exactly how prepared the Roman army was. It didn't deter Hannibal. Nothing deterred Hannibal. But Massinissa arrived at Scipio's camp first, with 4,000 Numidian cavalry and 6,000 infantry. The strategic balance had just shifted dramatically. Hannibal arrived with his army near a town called Zama Regia, roughly 100 kilometers southwest of Carthage, on a flat, open plain that favored neither side unduly. He made camp about 3 kilometers from the Roman position. And then he did something that tells you everything about who Hannibal was as a man. He sent a message to Scipio. I want to meet. Alone. Polybius, our most reliable ancient source for this period, tells us the 2 generals actually did meet, on the plain between their 2 armies, accompanied only by interpreters, with both sides watching from the hills above. Picture that scene. The 2 greatest commanders of their generation, standing face to face for the first time in their lives, each fully aware that one of them was about to lose everything. Hannibal spoke first. He was gracious, generous, and honest in a way that must have surprised even his own men. He acknowledged Rome's victories. He admitted that fortune had turned. He proposed peace, essentially the terms that had already been agreed to before Carthage had stupidly blown them up. Keep what you have, let us keep what we have, everyone goes home. It was not a desperate gamble. It was a calculated offer from a man who genuinely understood the strategic reality. Hannibal knew he was going into battle at a disadvantage. He knew his cavalry was outnumbered, his elephants were undertrained, and his infantry was composed partly of raw recruits. If he could get a reasonable peace without fighting, that was the better outcome for Carthage. Scipio said no. His answer was calm, almost cold. Carthage had broken the previous treaty, but they had attacked Roman ships in their own harbor. Rome could no longer trust Carthaginian promises. If Carthage wanted peace, they would have to earn it on the battlefield, and accept whatever terms Rome imposed after the fighting. The 2 men looked at each other for a moment. Then they walked back to their respective armies. The battle would be tomorrow. Now, before we get into the actual fighting, and I promise you, the fighting is worth the wait, let me give you the full tactical picture of what both men were planning, because understanding the setup is what makes the execution genuinely breathtaking. Hannibal arrayed his army in 3 lines, as was standard for ancient generals of his era. His first line was composed of mercenaries, Gauls, Ligurians, Iberians, Balearic slingers, experienced fighters, but not fighting for Carthage. His second line was Carthaginian and Libyan infantry, newer recruits, now less experienced. Hannibal actually placed them some distance behind the first line, separated by a gap. He did not want his second line to catch the panic if the first line broke. His third line, positioned at the rear, fresh and waiting, was his Italian veterans. 12 to 15,000 men who had spent 15 years in the field with him. Men who had survived Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae. In front of all of this, 80 war elephants lined up across the entire width of his formation. Or the shock weapon, the thing that was supposed to blow a hole in the Roman line before the infantry ever made contact. Scipio's formation was 3 lines, as usual, hastati in the front, principes in the middle, triarii in the rear. But here is where Scipio made the change that would define the battle. Instead of arranging his maniples in the traditional staggered checkerboard formation, he lined them up directly behind each other, creating long, straight corridors running from the front of the Roman formation all the way to the back. Between each column of maniples, there were wide open lanes. In those lanes, he placed his velites, light infantry skirmishers armed with javelins. These corridors were not an accident. They were a message to Hannibal's elephants. Here is where you run. On the Roman right wing, Massinисsa's 4,000 Numidian cavalry. On the left, Roman and Italian cavalry under Gaius Laelius, about 2,000 strong. To 6,000 cavalry total against Hannibal's 4,000. The math strongly favored Rome in cavalry. In infantry, Hannibal still had the numbers. In quality, well, that depended entirely on whether the elephants worked. Both armies began to advance. The ground was flat. The morning light was cutting low across the plain. Tens of thousands of men were watching each other with the specific, focused terror of people who know that a lot of them are about to die. Hannibal gave the order. But 80 war elephants, the largest concentration of these animals used in any battle during the entire Punic Wars, began to move. Their handlers goaded them forward into a walk, then a trot, their massive bodies building toward what was supposed to be an unstoppable charge into the Roman front line. What happened next is one of the most perfectly executed counter-tactics in military history. Scipio had ordered every trumpeter in the Roman army, every single one, to sound their instruments simultaneously as the elephants approached. The resulting noise was not just loud, it was overwhelming. A wall of sound unlike anything those elephants had ever experienced. Several of them immediately panicked, wheeled around, and stampeded, directly back into Hannibal's own cavalry on his left flank, disrupting their formation before the cavalry battle had even begun. Which the remaining elephants came on. And here is where Scipio's corridor system did its work. The velites in the lanes began hurling javelins at the oncoming animals, not trying to kill them, but to sting them, to direct them, to channel their panic toward the open corridors rather than into the solid walls of Roman shields on either side. It worked. Most of the elephants, presented with both the noise of the trumpets and the shield walls of the maniples, took the path of least resistance and charged straight through the lanes. They ran all the way through the Roman formation and out the back, where Roman soldiers hunted them down and killed them. Some elephants did strike the hastati directly, causing real casualties. Let's not sanitize this. Elephants are terrifying, and the Romans who faced them that morning were not having a pleasant experience. But the formation held. The Roman lines did not break. Here is my honest assessment. This is the moment the battle was decided, even though nobody on the field quite knew it yet. Scipio had spent years preparing this specific counter. 3 devices at once: corridors to channel the animals, velites to sting and direct them, and that simultaneous blast of trumpets to panic the ones that were already nervous. You don't improvise that in 30 seconds. You think about it for months. And that level of preparation is what separates good generals from great ones. And on the Roman flanks, the elephants who had panicked into Hannibal's own cavalry had done something invaluable. They had disordered the Carthaginian horse before Massinissa even had to fight them. Massinissa attacked. Laelius attacked on the other side. Both Carthaginian cavalry forces, already in disarray from the elephant panic, simply could not hold. They broke and ran, it pursued off the battlefield entirely by the Roman and Numidian horse. When Massinissa and Laelius pursued the Carthaginian cavalry off the field, Scipio lost his cavalry advantage temporarily. His horsemen were gone, chasing the enemy. He now had to fight Hannibal's superior numbers of infantry, including those 15,000 battle-hardened veterans, with only his legions. In other words, for the next 30 to 40 minutes, Scipio was on his own. And Hannibal was still alive and dangerous. And this is why I think Zama gets slightly undersold as a tactical achievement. Everyone focuses on the student defeats the master narrative and the elegant geometry of it. But there was a stretch in the middle of this battle where Scipio was genuinely at risk. Everything had to go right. The infantry had to hold. The cavalry had to come back. The timing had to be perfect. It was not a comfortable victory. It was a knife fight. The mercenaries in Hannibal's first line hit the Roman hastati hard, but these were experienced warriors. Gauls with their long, slashing swords, Iberians with their short, stabbing blades, Ligurians who had been fighting for decades. They did not fold easily. The Roman front line absorbed punishment and gave it back, and for a while the outcome looked genuinely unclear. But Roman discipline held. The hastati were trained for exactly this, absorbing the shock of an initial assault and grinding the enemy down through superior cohesion. Slowly, inevitably, the mercenaries began to give way. What happened next reveals something about Hannibal that I find genuinely dark, and I think it tells you something important about what this war had done to him. The mercenaries tried to fall back through Hannibal's second line to regroup. The Carthaginian second line didn't let them through. They leveled their weapons at the retreating men. Hannibal had given explicit orders. Do not let the first line contaminate the second line with their panic, and keep the lines separate. The result was chaos. Some mercenaries, trapped between the advancing Romans and their own side's weapons, turned and fought back against the Carthaginian second line. Others died where they stood. It was brutal and efficient. But it also tells you that Hannibal had gone into this battle knowing his own first and second lines were expendable. They were meant to be consumed. The only troops he truly valued were the veterans in the rear. And the Roman hastati pushed through the carnage and hit the Carthaginian second line. More fighting, more grinding, more casualties on both sides. The principals came up to support. The battle was becoming a brutal, exhausting slugfest. Exactly what Hannibal needed it to be, because somewhere at the back of his formation, 15,000 Italian veterans were standing fresh and watching and waiting. And here is where Scipio did something that, in my view, it is the single greatest individual command decision of this entire battle. He stopped. Right in the middle of the fighting, with his front two lines battered and disordered, and the most dangerous army unit in the world waiting for him at the back of Hannibal's formation, Scipio ordered his men to halt. He pulled the hastati back and reorganized them. He redeployed the Principes to extend his flanks outward, beyond the edges of Hannibal's veteran line. But he moved the triarii out to anchor both wings. Think about what it takes to execute that in the middle of a battle. The noise, the blood, the dead and dying underfoot. The knowledge that you need to reorder thousands of exhausted men while an enemy force that has never been defeated in 15 years of war is standing 80 meters away, watching you do it. But he did it. And when the Roman army advanced again, it was no longer just a frontal assault. It was an attempt at encirclement. Hannibal saw what Scipio was doing and widened his own line to prevent the wraparound. The two formations collided with tremendous force. This was the clash of the best infantry Carthage had ever put in the field against the reorganized, fresh-blooded Roman legions backed by the triarii. According to our sources, they fought hand-to-hand for what must have been an agonizing stretch of time. No elephants, no clever tactical tricks, just men killing each other as efficiently as they could. If you're finding this as fascinating as I am, and I know you are, because you're still here, hit that like button. This kind of deep historical content takes real work to put together, and every like tells the algorithm this is worth sharing. Now back to the battle. And then the cavalry came back. Massinissa and Laelius had pursued the Carthaginian cavalry completely off the battlefield. Now they turned around, and they could see from a distance the mass of infantry still locked in combat. But they didn't hesitate. They rode straight into the rear of Hannibal's veteran formation. There it is. That's the moment. That is the turn of the wheel. Hannibal's veterans, the men who had been with him since he was 30 years old, who had crossed the Alps and fought at Trebia and Trasimene and Cannae, and 100 smaller engagements over 15 years, were now pressed from the front by Roman legions and hit from behind by several thousand of the finest cavalry in the ancient world. Whereas they fought. Of course, they fought. These were men who had survived everything the world could throw at them. But there was no coming back from this. The cavalry closed the trap. Scipio's infantry pushed from the front. The Carthaginian formation collapsed. 20,000 Carthaginians died on that plain. Another 20,000 were captured. Roman losses were roughly 1,500 dead. Hannibal escaped. He rode from the battlefield and made his way back to Carthage. But he walked into the Carthaginian Senate, a body he had not addressed in more than 15 years, and told them, without softening it, that he had lost not just a battle, but the entire war, and that they should sue for peace immediately. One senator, apparently unable to process the reality of the situation, started to object. Hannibal physically grabbed him and hauled him back to his seat. This was not a moment for political maneuvering. Carthage accepted Scipio's terms. Oh, and now we reach the part of this story that I think is, in many ways, more interesting than the battle itself. What happens to men like this afterward? The peace terms Scipio imposed were harsh, but not immediately annihilating. Carthage lost all of its overseas territory. Spain, the islands, everything. It had to surrender most of its warships. It was forbidden from waging war outside Africa, and even inside Africa. It could only fight with explicit Roman permission. And it was required to pay an indemnity of 10,000 talents of silver, an astronomical sum, spread over 50 years. That last clause was deliberate. Rome wasn't just punishing Carthage. Rome was ensuring that for the next half-century, every ounce of Carthaginian economic energy would be directed toward paying Rome, rather than rebuilding military power. Hannibal himself was not handed over to Rome. Scipio, to his credit, did not demand that. In fact, within a year, Hannibal was elected suffete of Carthage, the highest civilian magistracy, by popular vote. The man who had spent 35 years at war was now a civil administrator. And here's the thing that gets lost in most tellings of this story. He was excellent at it. Hannibal threw himself into the job with the same ferocious intelligence he had brought to military command. He reformed Carthage's finances, rooted out corruption among the aristocracy, and restructured the city's revenue systems so efficiently that within a few years, Carthage was not only paying its indemnity on schedule, but prospering enough that Hannibal actually proposed paying off the entire 50-year debt early. Think about that. The man who had terrorized Rome for 2 decades was now making Rome's peace terms look generous by simply being better at running an economy than anyone expected. There is something almost funny about it, and something deeply revealing. Hannibal wasn't just a soldier. He was brilliant at whatever he decided to do. Rome had spent 17 years trying to kill him. In the end, the thing that destroyed him was his own city's politicians. They sent word to Rome. Hannibal, they claimed, was in contact with Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire. He was building Carthage back up for another war. He needed to be dealt with, Rome sent a delegation to investigate. Hannibal saw the writing on the wall with perfect clarity. And if Rome pressed for his extradition, the Carthaginian Senate would hand him over without a second thought. He had given his entire life to this city, and it would sell him to his enemies to save itself a diplomatic headache. He left before the Roman delegation arrived. He never went back. What followed was one of the more melancholy chapters in ancient history. Hannibal spent his remaining years as a fugitive advisor, the most famous military genius in the world, perpetually in motion, perpetually hunted, serving as a consultant to kings who were simultaneously honored to have him and afraid of the trouble he attracted. He went first to Tyre, then to the court of Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire. Antiochus was preparing for war with Rome, and who better to advise him than the man who had given Rome its worst decades? Hannibal counseled an aggressive strategy: strike first, take the war to Italy, force Rome to fight on multiple fronts. Antiochus didn't listen. He fought Rome at Magnesia in 190 BCE and lost comprehensively. Hannibal's strategic advice had been correct. It went unheeded. He moved on. Armenia for a time. Then to the court of King Prusias of Bithynia, a small kingdom in what is now northwestern Turkey. He helped Prusias win some naval engagements. He kept moving. But Rome never forgot him, and never stopped looking. In 183 BCE, 64 years old, in a foreign court, far from Carthage, Hannibal received word that Prusias had agreed to hand him over to Rome. Roman envoys were already surrounding the villa. They found all the exits blocked. Hannibal had prepared for this. He had carried poison with him for years, a small vial that served as his ultimate guarantee of personal sovereignty. He drank it. His last recorded words, according to Livy, were, "Let us relieve the Romans of their long anxiety, since they find it too much to wait for an old man's death." Even in death, the man had timing. If the story of Hannibal is a tragedy, then the story of Scipio Africanus is something different. It's a story about how democracies, even great ones, sometimes devour the men who save them. Scipio returned to Rome in 201 BCE as the most celebrated Roman alive. His triumph was the grandest the city had seen in generations, but he was awarded the agnomen Africanus, the first Roman general in history to be given a name honoring a conquest outside Italy. He served as censor, as princeps senatus, the first man of the Senate. His second consulship came in 194 BCE. By all appearances, he was at the apex of Roman public life. And then came Cato the Elder. Marcus Porcius. Cato was everything Scipio was not: provincial, anti-Hellenic, obsessively frugal, and deeply suspicious of anyone with too much charm or too many Greek books. He was also, it must be said, brilliant and relentlessly political. He led a sustained campaign against Scipio and his circle, accusations of financial impropriety, of accepting bribes from Antiochus III during peace negotiations, of using public funds improperly. The specific charges are murky and frankly probably exaggerated. What Cato was really attacking was Scipio's cultural sensibility, his Philhellenism, his comfort with wealth and elegance, his air of almost aristocratic superiority. Rome in the early 2nd century BCE was not yet comfortable with men who seemed bigger than the Republic itself. Scipio defended himself before the Senate. At one point, he reportedly looked around at his accusers and said something to the effect of, "This day, senators, I conquered Hannibal and Carthage. Let us give thanks to the gods rather than entertaining the accusations of my enemies." Then he walked out. It was magnificent. It was also, politically, the beginning of the end. He withdrew from Rome to his estate at Liternum on the Campanian coast. He farmed. He studied Greek philosophy. He corresponded with friends. He did not return to public life. His will contained one final devastating instruction. He was to be buried at Liternum, not in Rome, not in the city that owed him its continued existence. He would not give Rome the honor of his tomb. He died in 183 BCE, the same year as Hannibal. And I don't believe in cosmic symmetry as a rule of history. But sometimes the universe seems to have a dark sense of irony. The two men who had defined an age, who had spent their lives locked in the most consequential strategic rivalry of the ancient world, left it in the same year, both of them, in different ways, rejected by the cities they had served. Drop a comment below and tell me, who do you think history treated more unfairly, Hannibal or Scipio? I'm genuinely curious whether people side with the genius who lost or the winner who was forgotten. It's one of the great unanswerable questions in ancient history, and I want to know what you think. History has a bad habit of making decisive victories look inevitable in retrospect. We look at Zama and think, of course Scipio won. He had better cavalry. He had Massinissa. He had the tactical genius of the corridor formation. Of course it worked. But nothing about that morning was inevitable. If the elephants had been better trained, they might have broken the Roman lines before Scipio's corridors could channel them. If Massinissa had arrived a day later, the battle would have been fought on very different terms. If Hannibal's veterans had gotten the chance to engage a disorganized Roman front without cavalry interference, even Scipio's tactical brilliance might not have been enough. The treaty that followed stripped Carthage of everything that had made it a rival to Rome. Territory. The fleet, military autonomy, gone. Carthage was kept alive but declawed, a wealthy commercial city with no ability to project power. But Rome being Rome, even that wasn't enough in the long run. The story of Carthage after Zama is the story of a slow-motion execution. Massinissa, Rome's Numidian ally, now king of a powerful state, repeatedly raided Carthaginian territory, knowing that the treaty prohibited Carthage from defending itself without Roman permission. When Carthage finally, as in desperation, raised an army to defend against Numidian aggression in 151 BCE, Rome used it as a pretext. Cato the Elder, by then an old man who ended every Senate speech with Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed, finally got what he wanted. The Third Punic War, 149 to 146 BCE, was less a war than a siege, followed by an annihilation. Roman forces under Scipio Aemilianus, the adoptive grandson of Scipio Africanus, which is a poetic coincidence that would be too on the nose for fiction, took Carthage after months of brutal urban combat and burned it to the ground. The civilization that had produced Hannibal was erased. Not just defeated, erased. For the Roman military, Zama was a pedagogical moment of the first order. Scipio's innovations did not die with him. The corridor tactic for dealing with war elephants became doctrine, but the flexible manipulation of the maniple system, the ability to reorganize formation in the middle of a battle, to extend flanks, to create pincer movements with infantry rather than relying entirely on cavalry for encirclement, became the standard toolkit of the Roman legion for generations. And here is the historical irony that I find most remarkable. Scipio defeated Hannibal using tactics derived from Hannibal. The double envelopment at Zama, cavalry chasing off the enemy horse, but then returning to close the encirclement from behind while infantry pinned the front, was the same essential geometry as Cannae, applied in reverse. Hannibal invented the playbook. Scipio read it, understood it, and executed it against its author. You could argue, and I would, that this is the defining characteristic of Roman military success across the centuries. Not original genius, but systematic learning, institutional memory, and the willingness to adopt whatever your enemies did well and scale it up. Rome built an empire not by being more creative than everyone else, but by being better at incorporating lessons from every war it fought. Julius Caesar studied Scipio. The commanders of the late Republic studied both. The military doctrines that Zama validated echoed through Western military thinking for 1,000 years. Geopolitically, the consequences of Zama cannot be overstated. Before the Second Punic War, the Mediterranean was a genuinely multipolar world. Carthage controlled the Western Basin. The Hellenistic successor states, Macedonia, the Seleucid Empire, and Ptolemaic Egypt, divided the Eastern Basin. Rome was a major power, but not yet a hegemon. After Zama, the multipolar world began its rapid dissolution. With Carthage neutered, Rome turned east. Macedonia fell in 197 BCE. The Seleucids were dealt a decisive defeat at Magnesia in 190 BCE. By 146 BCE, the year Carthage was destroyed, Rome also destroyed Corinth and effectively reduced mainland Greece to a Roman province. In less than 60 years after Zama, Rome controlled the entire Mediterranean coast. Now, I want you to think about the downstream consequences of this for a moment, because they extend right to your doorstep. A Roman-dominated Mediterranean meant Roman infrastructure, roads, administrative systems, common law, trade networks spread across Western Europe, on North Africa, and the Middle East. That infrastructure became the vessel through which Christianity spread from a minor sect in Judea to the state religion of the empire, and eventually to the dominant faith of Western civilization. The Roman legal tradition became the foundation of European law. The Latin language, in its various evolutionary forms, became French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian. Roman political concepts, the Senate, the Republic, or the idea of mixed government, filtered through Renaissance thinking into the constitutional framers who designed the American system of government. If Hannibal had won at Zama, none of this chain of consequences would have worked the same way. Maybe some of it would have happened anyway, through different channels. History rarely respects clean counterfactuals, but the specific path that led from ancient Rome to the world you live in right now runs directly through that plain in Tunisia. Zama is one of maybe a dozen battles in all of recorded history that genuinely changed the direction of civilization. This question has occupied military historians for 2,000 years, and I want to give you my honest answer rather than the sanitized version. The standard explanation, he didn't have cavalry, his elephants weren't trained, Scipio's tactics were superior, is accurate as far as it goes. But it's incomplete. For Hannibal lost at Zama for the same reason he never quite won in Italy. Carthage could not match the institutional depth of Rome. Think about what Rome demonstrated in the Second Punic War. They lost Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae in rapid succession. Over 200,000 men were killed or captured in 3 years. By any reasonable calculation of ancient state capacity, those losses should have broken Rome. They didn't. Rome kept conscripting. Rome kept fighting. That Rome absorbed each catastrophe and reorganized and tried again, not because any individual Roman leader was a genius, but because the Roman state had systems, political, military, social, that could sustain and regenerate fighting capacity in ways that Carthage simply could not. Carthage never sent Hannibal adequate reinforcements, not because it was impossible, but because the Carthaginian oligarchy was more concerned with commercial profits, factional politics, and not giving Hannibal too much power than with actually winning their existential war. His brother Hasdrubal's attempt to reinforce him was a single, isolated expedition rather than a sustained, strategic effort. And it failed. Hannibal was a genius operating within a system that was, at a fundamental level, unserious about the war it had started. Scipio, by contrast, was a gifted commander operating within a system that was absolutely serious about winning. Even when winning seemed impossible, even when it required 15 more years of fighting after the worst military disasters the state had ever experienced. The lesson here, and I believe it applies far beyond ancient military history, is this: individual brilliance can win battles. It cannot substitute for institutional resilience. Hannibal was the greatest battlefield commander of his age, possibly of any age. And he lost because the organization behind him couldn't match the organization behind his opponent. That should make you think about modern institutions, modern organizations, and modern states. The structure you build around brilliant individuals matters as much as the individuals themselves. Come back to that plane for a moment. Come back to the morning before the battle. Two men, standing alone between two armies. One of them is the greatest military genius of his generation, possibly of his civilization. He is past 60 in a soldier's body, with one eye clouded from a river crossing in the Italian marshes, looking at a man 20 years his junior who had grown up in his shadow, who had buried his father and uncle because of decisions Hannibal had made. He offered peace. He was turned down. I've spent a lot of time thinking about what that morning felt like for both of them. And I'll tell you honestly, I find Hannibal more sympathetic than most Western historians do. He was a man who had given everything to a war his city started and then abandoned him to fight. He crossed the Alps. He won every battle. He made every correct strategic decision in the field. He was let down at every turn by the people he was fighting for. And then he came home to defend them, without adequate cavalry, with an army of raw recruits, as against the one Roman general smart enough to have studied him properly. And he lost. He walked back to Carthage. He told them the truth. He advised surrender. He tried to rebuild what was left. And eventually, his own city betrayed him to Rome to save themselves a political headache. Scipio, for his part, won the greatest victory any Roman general had achieved in living memory, saved the Republic from its most dangerous external threat, and spent his final years being prosecuted by political enemies in the city he had saved. He retired to a farm and left instructions not to be buried in Rome. Both men, in different ways, were too big for their worlds. I think that's worth sitting with. The story of Zama is not just a story about clever tactics and cavalry timing. It's a story about what happens to extraordinary people, what the societies they serve ask of them, what those societies are willing to give back, and what gets lost when the transaction turns out to be less equal than the extraordinary person deserved. Hannibal and Scipio died the same year. They never met again after that morning on the plain. History recorded their names and forgot almost everything else about who they were as people. We have our battles. We have a few speeches. We have the silence of 22 centuries between them and us. What I hope you take from this story is not just the tactical genius of Zama, though that is genuinely worth admiring. What I hope you take is the larger shape of it, the way one man's obsessive study of his greatest enemy produced the tactics that finally ended a 15-year nightmare, and the way history is sometimes, if rarely, just about the right person showing up at the right moment with exactly the right lesson already learned. Scipio was ready for Hannibal because he had spent his entire adult life preparing for Hannibal. Not just militarily, philosophically. He understood how Hannibal thought. He understood what Hannibal valued. And when the moment came, on a flat plain in Tunisia on an October morning, he used that understanding to build corridors for the elephants and wait for cavalry he trusted to come back. It worked. It ended the world as both men had known it. And it built the world that you and I live in. That is the Battle of Zama. From as if this video gave you something to think about, and I genuinely hope it did, the single best thing you can do for this channel right now is hit that like button. It sounds like a small thing, but it is genuinely the most powerful signal you can send to tell the algorithm that this kind of in-depth historical content is worth promoting. If you want more of this, more deep dives into the battles and figures and turning points that actually made the modern world, then subscribing is how you make sure you don't miss the next one. The comment section is open, and I read everything. Tell me, who do you think history shortchanged more, Hannibal or Scipio? Or tell me if you think I got something wrong. I enjoy a good argument with people who actually know their history. Thank you for spending an hour with two dead generals on a Tunisian plain and me. I'll see you in the next one.